is November 6, 2024, and Donald Trump has been elected the 47th president of the United States of America. What in the world does that mean for the nation of Ukraine? We're going to take a few minutes and explore that today on this edition of the Ukraine Story podcast. Hello to our friends around the world. This is DW with Ukraine Story. I'm here in the studio today via Zoom with the executive producer of Ukraine Story podcast, Honor Phillips. How you doing today, Honor?
I'm doing good. It's great to be here.
Well, Honor, let me begin by asking you, what in the world should be our first response to Donald Trump regarding the nation of Ukraine being elected president of the United States?
That is the question. The first thing I would say is a new president being elected is what will happen for the next 4 years for as long as the American Republic continues to exist. So it's a part of the nature of our democratic system, and it's normal. And our allies need to understand this, and prepare for this. Ukraine, most of all in this particular context, because of everything that is on the line for them. There's so much to say in regards to this. I know I have a lot of friends in Ukraine who view a Trump victory as the end of American support, which I think is actually a misunderstanding of the way our system works. And I also know friends who are also in Ukraine, who are Ukrainians, who view this as a positive step forward, at least on the social level, if not for the economic or military support. I think you kind of need to dive into this to break down each one of these different elements. But I think from whatever perspective, whatever side you come from, it is a notable shakeup and something that really everybody should have been preparing for, because it's been a very, very high likelihood, basically for the last 4 years through the whole Biden administration.
Well, let's today look at three issues that I'm particularly interested in. One is, what should be the number one goal of those that support freedom in the world, and specifically in Ukraine at this moment? What should our goal be now that we have a Trump presidency? And then I want to ask ourselves, why are the next 2 months especially important to the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine? And finally, the third thing I want to look at before we say goodbye today is the question of Ukraine's specific direction in the days to come. Should Ukraine be more reliant on the United States, less reliant? Should it develop a greater spirit of independence? And I think both you and I are going to be arguing, based on our previous conversations, that now is the time more than ever for a shift in how Ukraine approaches itself and the way it stands in the world today, and that this will actually engender much respect and actually engender more support from the United States of America over the long run, possibly. Well, we're in a situation right now where the Senate has been captured by Republicans. We have at present at least 52 Republican senators giving them a clear majority. The House is still up for grabs. The Republicans are still in the lead in the ballot count, but there are, at the moment of this recording, at least 50 different congressional districts that are undecided. But if it turns out that we have a Republican majority in the Senate, a Republican majority in the House, and also we have the Republicans controlling the executive branch, we will be in an unprecedented historical moment that could potentially have great impact on how policy is influenced. I also want to point out that if it turns out that the House flips Democrat, it will be the very first time in the history of the United States that there has been a flip in the party in the White House, a flip in the party in the Senate, and a flip in the party of the House. It will be historically unprecedented. But there's probably reason to believe that we're going to end up with the House, the Senate, and the White House all under Republican control. By the time this show airs, the answer may be obvious to the world, but at the point we are right now, and for the purpose of this conversation, it's not quite as important for us to figure that out. Let's observe why there has been so much confusion with a brief discussion of sort of the Biden legacy and the Trump legacy leading up to this day, November 6, 2024. So first of all, because Biden echoed words like "we're with Ukraine," to the end, because he pushed for financial aid packets, there was the perception that somehow Biden was one of Ukraine's strongest advocates in the world. In reality, a lot of the problems in Ukraine emerged during the Obama-Biden administration, where we failed to honor our commitments as a friend to Ukraine that had committed to stand with them based on getting them to disarm themselves back in the 1990s with the Budapest Memoranda, et cetera, and really what was in the best interest of the United States to stop Russian aggression. Well, we didn't do that under Obama and Biden. And the truth of the matter was that Trump was the first person during his first presidency to send anything over because Obama put the kibosh on it. And then Biden becomes president. And during this time, on the one hand, saying, well, we want Ukraine to win, we want them to beat Russia. Biden has also strapped Ukraine to a completely unfeasible position, a never-ending war where victory is not in sight, where they're prevented from taking the necessary measures, where they don't have the specific tools, which had they had them, could have led to an early victory. Ukraine has defied all odds, notwithstanding the fact that the Biden administration was an impediment to victory in Ukraine. So it's a mistake to think that Biden was the great friend of Ukraine. And we see more and more, even in recent months, between various leaks, between things between them and their long-term objectives with Russia that appear to be coming out, that Biden was not the great friend of Ukraine that the world said. But what about Trump? Trump has certainly surrounded himself with a number of individuals who are at the forefront of the pro-Putin disinformation, false information campaign. And these individuals are not friends of Ukraine. And the comments that President Trump has made have not been helpful on many, many different levels. The promises he has made in terms of settling the war seem to be unfeasible and seem to be in contradiction as far as they've been leaked through people like J.D. Vance and others to the actual interest of Ukraine. We could break it down further. I really want us to talk about everything moving forward. But the point I would make is that it hasn't been as simple. Trump is completely opposed to Ukraine. Biden is completely in favor of Ukraine. That is not an accurate assessment of the situation. That Trump has made, I think, disturbing comments is a reality. That the people around him have not been helpful also is a reality. But I think we need to understand Trump as we move forward into the future. And I'm going to suggest that one of the most important things that advocates for Ukraine take upon themselves is persuasion. Now is the time for persuasion. And you can't be persuasive if your whole mission is to attack a man or to use every epithet pandered by the media to accuse him of various things. You will never be persuasive. You will fail in your mission and objective. Now is a time for persuasion, and 100% of our energy must be to influence Donald Trump as opposed to considering him a lost cause. Any thoughts on that?
I think you're spot on, and I would also make the comment that this strategy of persuasion really should have started back during the beginning of the campaigning cycle. Before that, they should have been talking to Trump in this manner from the very beginning. Again, the American system is dynamic. The likelihood that he was going to become president was a possibility and high this whole time. So they, in my humble opinion, whoever is in the diplomatic world of the Zelensky team should have been thinking about this beforehand. Now, we can't go back and we can't rewrite the history. We can start where we are today with Trump being the president-elect. I would really like to see those in Ukraine try to cultivate a better relationship, not just with Trump, but with people in Congress and in the House of Representatives.
That's a big one. I want us to get into that in a minute.
I go back and I look at our other allies. I look at the UK, I look at our European allies, and they're in a different position because there's a safety blanket over them with NATO and with all these other treaty organizations. I understand there's a safety blanket there, but it's also really helpful to look at the way that they conduct international relations with the United States. And there's a sense of calm that they try to maintain and of longevity, even in the way they talk about these things. And I know it's incredibly difficult to do that in Ukraine because, I mean, we're watching as villages are falling weekly in the east, and every single day cities
And Russian atrocities, which which are so horrifying, you understand why people respond with such intensity.
Exactly, exactly. So I want to be careful because I've been to Ukraine. I've spent time there. I feel personally, and I also understand the way Ukrainians feel this incredible sense of urgency, which there is. But again, we're talking about moving and swaying countries and peoples and huge steps here. So there has to be a dynamism in the way you work with both partners in Europe and in America. So I would really like to see those relationships being cultivated, stemming from Ukraine. Um, as much as
So
I
I
would
think,
like the Americans going over there, the Ukrainians need to be doing that as well, coming here.
in my opinion, first of all, I agree with you, and thank you for that. In my opinion, I would say that an element of persuasion is number one, to get rid of the false thinking, Donald Trump, ultimate permanent enemy of Ukraine, although we've conceded the massive problems that we've seen. Biden, long-term friend, not truthful, not an accurate assessment. So we need to get rid of that. And the second thing I think we need to do, if our job is to be persuasive, is to get rid of some misunderstandings regarding Donald Trump himself. So let's name a couple of them. Donald Trump is not an isolationist. Many of the people near him are isolationists, but as president of the United States, he did never articulated isolationism. He did not act upon isolationism. That thinking, which has infected the anti-Ukrainian branch of the Republican Party, is not reflective of Trump. Trump thinks in altogether different categories. He's not thinking in terms of isolating America from the world. He's thinking in terms of deals. He's thinking in terms of negotiations. He's thinking in terms of splitting the baby. But he's also the guy that will say, I will act internationally when necessary if I need to do it. So let's just get rid of the isolationist label. That is not an accurate representation of Trump. Trump does not have a clear foreign policy. He doesn't have sort of a mass or a guiding light principle other than American self-interest in the moment, perhaps. So he's not a foreign policy giant. He's put other people around him. Foreign policy is not the strong point of Donald Trump, but foreign policy is a critical element of being president of the United States. So he's not an isolationist, though many of the people around him, in fact, are. He's also not an anti-Ukrainian person in the sense that he believes Ukraine is not a democracy, is persecuting Christians, various things like that. He's never given any indication of that. The people around him have, his advisors have, and that's of great concern. It should be of great concern, but that's not a place where Trump has gone. And I'm pointing this out because if we know anything about Donald Trump is that in one sense, he's very consistent with himself, but his changes in policies and positions can appear to be erratic. At one moment, he's the leader of the right to life movement. The next moment, he is, chiding pro-lifers for being too radical, and he's taking a different approach altogether. What is a guiding principle for Donald Trump? I'm going to be the deal maker. I'm going to bring America together by trying to make everybody happy. I'm going to bring Putin and Zelensky together. We'll find something that they're both happy with, and we'll find a happy medium. Do I think that these things are realistic? Absolutely not. But you need to understand Donald Trump's thinking and understand how he acts, or you are going to miss the mark and how to be persuasive. So I think an important point is, what are the touch points that influence Trump? And that's a bigger conversation, probably for another podcast, but there are touch points which are clearly influential to him. Here are a couple we know for a fact. If you are an outspoken enemy of him who's putting him down, he's going to want to rip you to pieces. He won't listen to you. He won't talk to you. He won't negotiate with you. You're just an enemy. If you're a person who flatters him, who likes him, who treats him with the respect he believes worthy of, you're his friend. He'll talk to you. He'll work with you. So the question of perception and diplomacy and even the nature of the dialogue is something that those of us that care about Ukraine need to take very seriously. We're going to have to get rid of, those of you who embraced it before, this extreme language, which is a total turnoff to the president and puts him in a state of sort of embattlement with you. We don't want that if the goal is to make a difference. What about Putin? Well, he said some very laudatory, praising words of Putin. He appears, and the people around him appear to be very chummy with Putin in many ways, but I would say Trump isn't exclusively that way. It's not about, I think, Trump just being chummy with Putin. Once again, it's about negotiations. It's about who comes out on top. It's about perception. It's about power. It's about all of these different things. And if Trump is persuaded that Putin will not listen to Trump, and Putin will not be a friend to the United States on the world scale, the dynamic of the decision making may change in his mind. And I want to make one more comment and then ask for your take on this, Honor. So we also have to distinguish between the priorities of a candidate versus the priorities of a president, because they're different.
Yeah.
What do candidates look for? The most extreme comments they can make that will polarize and draw their base to them, certainly up to the party nomination. And afterwards, in the past, they tended to sort of appeal more broadly. Trump really didn't do that very much. He still appealed to this core base, which he believed he was building. And it appears he was successful and correct in that if you look at the outcome of the presidential election. But the comments about, we would never have the war if I had been president and Biden wasn't president, or I'm going to solve this in one day. These are campaign stump speeches. Do they create obligations? Yes, they do. We'll get to the obligation of his promise regarding Ukraine in a moment. But these are campaign promises, the goal of which is to say, I'm a problem solver. I'm a negotiator. I will project strength when everybody else projected weakness. But all those things that you say during your campaign are quite different from the realities when you come into office. What happens when you come into office? Well, you may have Tucker Carlson still whispering lies and Putin propaganda in your ear. Certainly, he's going to be whispering in J.D. Vance's ear. But there's a whole new dynamic of influence and realities that a president takes on January 20th. Care to elaborate on that?
I think you're spot on with that, and that's really important to remember. And also, there is, I mean, unending precedent if you look back at history with that. Every single, presidency, you see how fiery the language got. I mean, this is the most intense now I have ever heard, seen, or read about. But you go back through American history, and it's always been this way. I know there's some skepticism of talking about the realities of being a president that kick in when you become president. And I know that particular argument in regards to Trump is complicated, but what you're talking about here and understanding him and the way he operates is incredibly important in regards to sort of the public dialogue and the volume and tempo of commentary on everything. One of the things which I think has really put a bad taste in a lot of Americans' mouths is the way we have been speaking about our own leaders and about our own friends.
Wow, that's so true.
As an American audience, if you are hearing our allies or say our own domestic media through hyperbole call our candidates fascists, dictators, etc., you immediately cut that value in half when people start talking about Putin that way, or when people start talking about Lukashenko of Belarus that way. And this is really important to remember. If you're,
who are real fascists, who are
who are right,
genuine dictionary textbook
right.
fascists.
And this is the war of words here is, I think there needs to be a whole study of this, of this first part of our century is the war of words, because it's remarkable, but it's incredibly powerful. And it's something for those who want to befriend the United States to really understand. Don't use hyperbole when speaking about your friends.
Wow.
Be accurate, be precise,
Yeah.
and also call a spade a spade. Now that Trump is president, I think it's really important not to suddenly do a cartwheel and act like everything he's ever done has been fantastic just to get in his good graces, because I don't believe that. And I also think that his particular character and demeanor and strategy in the way that he goes about his political life is one which is incredibly detrimental to our political system and to society and to the general dialogue.
The sense in which we've lost civility in a real sense in public discourse.
Absolutely. Now that he has become president-elect, we need to adjust our strategy and course accordingly, while also realizing that you don't have to give ground on your beliefs or on your opinions. I will continue to disagree with him about the way he goes about his political life in general. I think is off the rails and without a compass, I think is the main point. He doesn't have a compass. As much as I find that distasteful, he's still the president of the United States, which means he's still the commander in chief, or he will be.
And he's really right about some things. There's
Right,
some things really right about.
right,
And
exactly.
those are things which capture the attention of the American people. There is no question that the handling of the immigration crisis was nothing short of catastrophic. The manipulation of people during COVID was something that concerned a lot of Americans out there. It doesn't matter where you stand on those issues. Americans were concerned about that. And there's no question Americans have been concerned about the economy. You can't deny it. Those are realities, and they influenced a majority of people in this recent election.
This is just a comment I would make. Trump ran this election on security of our national borders and on economy, largely speaking. There were a bunch of other issues sprinkled in there as well. But if you were to talk to 70% of the people I know who probably voted for Trump, the first thing they were going to say would be economy, infrastructure, inflation, these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
This is really important for our allies to understand as well, because it's very easy when we look at allied nations or friendly countries to only see the outward headlines of foreign policy, but also realize what goes on in the country. The big stuff for everyone who lives in that country is what happens internally. That's important to remember when talking about winning over Americans as well, because it's not just the leaders of the United States who need to be won.
Mhm.
It's not just those in the Senate and those in Congress. It's the American people. That's the big point here. It's the American people, because they are the voters, and actually they're the ones who actually get things done. People call congressmen. That actually makes a difference. When you have 30 people calling a congressman and saying, "Hey, I want you to cut aid off to Ukraine," or "Hey, we need to help our friends in Ukraine," that congressman is going to listen to them.
Now, I'm going to make a comment which is going to be very controversial. Some of our listeners will not agree with me on this. I certainly respect your opinion. It's my belief that the great excess that we've seen in American politics on the left and on the right is largely encouraged and built by the other side. How has the MAGA movement reached such incredible strength? People see the excess on the part of the left, the extremism, the name calling, and they hate it. They hate it. And they see the Trump derangement syndrome, which is real, and they think this just isn't right. On the other hand, on the right, you see people within that movement responding at times with a form of hysteria as well, which is just mind-boggling at times. There were many, many Americans who had reached the point where they sincerely believed, that there was no human way possible for Donald Trump to win the presidency, because American government is so deeply, deeply rigged and controlled. And to quote one man I saw on the Tucker Carlson show, the same people who staged a coup in Ukraine will not allow Donald Trump to win the presidency. All the assumptions are wrong, and they're all off.
And this
And
is not a
people,
fringe group anymore. It's a substantial amount of the population at this point.
yeah, right, right, and that should be a concern for us. I guess what we're saying is there needs to be a return to reason. There needs to be a return to civility. That's going to be very, very important. We've seen almost the annihilation of actual journalism in the United States of America over the last 8 years. It's become so partisan. And of course, it began with the left being so extraordinarily biased and partisan. And now on the right, everything is run by podcasts of people who are, sometimes they seem like unhinged ideologues on one extreme, to people all along that perspective there. But what's gone is an actual analysis of facts and issues and details, so we can reach rational conclusions. And I
Yeah.
think if we want to be successful, we've got to return to that. We have to make a case based on real information and real facts. We need to be able to defend it. And that's part of the story going to Trump. Now, let's get back to the influences on President Trump. So Trump, during his acceptance speech, said, I want to give Robert RFK a place in the White House where he can influence policy that I think he's strong. And Trump perceives that to be healthcare issues and various things related to food. He said, but I'm going to keep him away from oil issues and other things where RFK is more of a green movement oriented type of a person, sort of, in those particular areas. And Trump disagrees with that. I mention that because there are people that Trump will use, he will like, they will be his allies, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will be the specific decision makers on practices. Well, what happens on foreign policy? Well, when Trump became president in 2016, you know what he did? He took all the old guys and he kept them in a position of power, many of them. So the people that had been there before, many of them, became influential. They ultimately got fired. There were conflicts, there were problems. Maybe he won't do that again, but he still has to work with the military. He still has to work with the chiefs of staff. He still has to work with a lot of people out there. And they do not, in any way, shape, or form, agree with the sort of alternative reality Twilight Zone perspective that Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson are giving the world and what's actually happening in Eastern Europe. So they see things from a very different perspective. And there's the possibility for influence there. Now, if I wanted to influence Donald Trump, some of the things I would want to get to him, I would actually want to make the case to them of Russian atrocities, because if you listen to his comments about the complete annihilation of Ukraine, which is misguided, there is at the very least this empathy he's presenting for this is so terrible, so many people are dying, but never has there been a conversation about the extraordinary barbarism and cruelty and violation of the rules of war under Putin, which bring us back in tone and style to what we remember from the Second World War, coming out of the Third Reich. I'm not saying it's completely analogous. There are differences, obviously, but in terms of the disregard for human life at such a level, what Russia's done has been nothing short of extraordinary and a transition in world history. I think Trump needs to get facts about that. He needs to learn about Christians that are being persecuted by Russia, not just the misinformation coming from the Muscovite patriarchy about alleged infractions of religious freedom in Ukraine, which are really out of touch with reality. But even maybe more importantly than all those things is we're going to have to get to him with America's geostrategic position in the world, and maybe more importantly than anything, help him to realize this axis of evil, which has come together between North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia, and their economic and geostrategic influence. It is going to be impossible for America to be a leader in the world, or to be great, or to be any of the things that we aspire to, and Trump claims to aspire to, if we do not understand the growing global menace and its implications to the world order. It is not small, it is defining. And I think that gets us back to what you were talking about with the Senate and the House. We have a fertile ground to influence congressmen and members of the House and senators on that issue, and at the same time, hopefully reach Trump. I don't think the isolationist will win out in the end when he's actually governing, but whether he gets the right message or not, I don't know. My guess is Trump wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize for something that he can't actually do, which is to sit down at a table with Zelensky and Putin, bring this war to an end. He's going to eventually have to face some hard realities. Your thoughts on this?
I think we're in total agreement there. I would like to see those in the United States and those in Ukraine and those in our European allies be thinking about this in the long term and be planning, preparing, and adjusting their strategy for the long term. If I were to speak to Donald Trump, I would say, okay, what are the things you care about? Immediate results, helping your friends, legacy, legacy, legacy. What does the future look like after you're gone? What do you want to be remembered for?
Those are good
for
great.
Ukraine needs to be thinking about the next 15 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years. I completely understand why there has been this sense of dog paddling and just staying above the water. And so much of the blame for that goes to the completely ridiculous way which the Biden-Harris administration conducted their aid and support without any sort of guiding star of strategy or objective or anything like that. It was haphazard at best. So I understand why there's been this sort of dog paddling issue in Ukraine, but I would want to, if I was speaking to Trump, I would want to say, what are the things, or these are the things which I believe are important to you. We need to start thinking and planning and preparing in this way as we work with our allies and as we also try to deter our enemies. And I think the Ukrainians should help to articulate the connectivity of all of this for sure, absolutely, and play their part in it as well. But I would also like to see Americans who are advocates for Ukraine continue to show how what is going on in Ukraine and Russia's invasion, Putin's invasion, how that affects the rest of the world. I'd like to see Americans who are supportive of Ukraine articulate that as well. It's that point, Ukraine not as a standalone issue, but Ukraine is sort of the linchpin of the next 25 years is
Mhm.
hugely important.
Well, okay, two more questions before we close this podcast for the day. And the next one is, why are the next 2 months specifically vital? And I'll begin this conversation by saying that we will recall that President Trump first said, I'll bring an end to the war in Ukraine on my first day of office. Then he moved it forward, ratcheting it up, saying that before I become president, I'll bring an end to the war. I'll sit
Mhm.
down with these various people. I don't think anyone really believes that's realistic, or that he understands the full implications of what he's saying there. It was a campaign promise. People wanted to believe it. But he's going to have to act on that promise, which means that now, not later, is the time to mount a campaign of persuasion to work with Donald Trump and to give him an understanding of what the real issues are. I'm not sure anyone's ever explained to him the fundamental issues, what's at stake from Ukraine's perspective, what Russia's long-term objectives really happen to be. And now is the time for us to work with senators and congressmen and other people to make that particular case. Otherwise, the case will be made by people that have become really famous for just reiterating Russian talking points. And that would be simply disastrous. We don't want that to happen. So now is the time for that. Your thoughts?
I would also expect for Ukraine's fight for freedom and the war there with Russia to go way down in the conversation for the next 2 months. So in the same way that I would boost preparation and articulation of the mission, the objective, the heart by Ukrainians, in the same way I would say be preparing now for when he steps into office. I also would say look back to history and look back at precedent and realize, okay, now he's been elected president, and these next 2 months are going to be a wild dash, both for the current president, who's finishing up his last things he wants to be
Mhm.
remembered for, as well as the president-elect Trump. So understand that the next 2 months will be a little bit chaotic, but come
So
2025, be ready. Be ready.
if I were making a prediction for what Trump will do, I believe he will attempt to reach out to both Zelensky and Putin, not to solve the problem now, but to reach some sort of an agreement that there will be a conversation after January 20th so he can buy himself some
Right.
time.
Save a little
It will
face.
be it'll be obvious that he can't do anything outside the presidency. And beyond that, it's just a really difficult proposition that it's hard for most people to take seriously, um, for it to be accomplished now. So he'll probably want to save face and buy time. I want to let our listeners know that at Ukraine Story, it's our belief that we have a window. It's one of the most important windows. I want you to think back to the incredible battles we had over funding for Ukraine and all the turmoil. And by the way, despite all those battles, despite its passage, the efficacy of that bill and how it's actually played out seems to be de minimis. It doesn't seem to have been all, in part because of the way the Biden administration handled it. It doesn't seem to be what Ukraine had hoped for by a long shot. So, what happens now? Well, one of the things we believe is that now is the time for persuasion on different levels. Uh, at Ukraine Story, we tackle that through articles, through reporting. Honor, you were recently speaking before members of parliament in Brussels after your trip to Pogrovsk, in which you talked about fighting on the ground and you gave sort of a long-term perspective. short-term perspective as well on what was actually happening. So we're engaged in advocacy, meeting with leaders, but making films is also a very important part of our work, documentary filmmaking. In fact, we're a foundation for journalism and documentary reporting. And our intention presently, we're working with absolutely wonderful team with Jonathan Fink and Silicon Curtain, based out of England, to produce a documentary in Ukraine. And God willing, if everything comes together just right, we'll be headed over first to Poland this month to do some preliminary recordings. If you want to learn more about that, visit the link which I'm putting below, and you may even consider helping us out with that. We're hoping to speak to the issues of what's happening right now by telling the stories of the people of Ukraine in a way which has immediate value and impact on the public discussion. So these 2 months matter a lot. We may look back and say they were the most important 2 months in years on the public debate because of the transition and the opportunity to influence. It's going to go one way or the other. And if there is not a thoughtful diplomatic means of persuasion right now, I mean, the loss could be catastrophic when President Trump actually takes office. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, that brings me to our very last point. And our last point, Honor, this is a really tender subject. It's maybe one of the most important subjects, but it's tender for many different reasons. And I'm just going to lay it out, and then I'd really benefit from your own thoughts on this. America itself as a nation has not really had a well thought through or coherent foreign policy probably since the Reagan years, where there was a stated, articulated policy. I'm not suggesting Reagan carried it out perfectly or that everyone in his administration understood it, but there was a peace through strength, anti-Soviet advancement direction in foreign policy that respected America as a global leader. There really has not been a consistent policy since then. We've been all over the map. We've done different things. And one of the things which has emerged is America doesn't keep her promises oftentimes. It's not uncommon for us to say one thing and then have our State Department undermine it and do something else. Our handling of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, with all we did to give them assurances that if they gave up their weapons, we would be beside them against Soviet imperialism, and our complete abdication of that and its sort of removal from the public discourse is one of many examples. I love my country. I believe in my country and its purpose and its future. But if I were in Ukraine right now, I would not trust American leadership to bail me out or to save me. I wouldn't trust American words. I would trust American actions, because we have a track record that needs to be improved upon, to put it mildly. So with all that being said, over the last 2 years plus now, we've seen Ukraine in a needy position, trying to remind the world that their soldiers are fighting for the post-World War II law order. They're fighting for everybody. Ukraine is suffering and dying, so Americans don't need to. That's been an accurate communication to the world. But along the way, even President Trump and his comments on Zelensky as a good salesman has sort of left the American people with the feeling that, well, Ukraine just wants money. Ukraine needs to be bailed out. Ukraine, help them, help them, help them. As opposed to a slightly different, yes, they need help. All of that's true. That message cannot go away. But it seems that now we should have a wake-up call. Ukraine should have a wake-up call that something more is needed in terms of where they go, what they look for, and how they want to present themselves to the world.
As for the incredible job the Ukrainian administration has done over the last 2.5 years, in my humble opinion, I still think there's more slack that needs to be cut. There is more work that needs to be done from within Ukraine in the way they prepare their military and the way they prepare their industrial complex for greasing the wheels of their not only their infrastructure, but the Army, the Air Force. And I know it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but if we're being incredibly serious here and we're looking down in the months ahead, while a huge factor is American support here in this war, and it might be the factor, it might be the key factor. Without the Ukrainians accepting the reality that American support might go away or might dwindle, without them
Yeah.
accepting that and preparing for that, they are walking into a very, very bad situation. So I would like to see the Ukrainian government and people in Ukraine start advocating to their government about this, start making the hard decisions and taking the hard steps to prepare their country for what it might look like if aid from the
Mhm.
United States dwindles or goes away.
I think I want to leave our conversation by saying that rather than this being a moment of fear, we need to turn that upside down on its head and see it as a moment of opportunity. We have a chance right now. Ukraine has a chance to redefine itself in terms of its perception before the world through a greater sense of independence and who it is, not simply looking to the United States uh, when the United States may not be there. So let's wrap up this conversation. And I think the most important thing that I would like to add at this point is that rather than this being a moment of fear, we should look at this as a moment of great opportunity. We have an opportunity to influence. We need to take it. Uh, Things are being shaken up. Okay, we think that's terrible, but the status quo is terrible. We need things shaken up. Could it be shaken up for the worse? You bet it could. I mean, is it leaning that way? Maybe, but I'm not completely sure. And we need to remember that in the history of the world, in the history of wars, there are always unknown factors that can come in a minute and turn everything upside down. We need to be ready for those moments. Life is a series of moments of preparation for brief moments of opportunity. And when those opportunities come, we need to take it. Our goal with President Trump should not be to harangue, harass him, or to spend our time in the media, you know, screaming about everything that the media is screaming about that they don't like about President Trump, but working with him, persuading him, reaching out to him, not viewing this as a lost cause. It is certainly not a lost cause. That's going to be very important for Ukraine. We need to frame issues better, and we need to put the most important issues on the table, and we actually need to defend them. Right now, the only people who are talking about them are the pro-Putin propagandists. Essentially, very few other people are. Oh, yes, there are heroes like our good friend Stephen Moore and others that are fighting the congressional warfare and other organizations. But with large platforms, there are a few people making the case as it needs to be made. That has to happen. That needs to change. And we need to move both beyond Biden praise syndrome and Trump derangement syndrome and be thinking in terms of policy objectives. It's going to be an exciting couple of months. A lot's on the line. Any parting words from you?
You summed it up pretty well there. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm not, what you just described right there is one of the reasons why I'm not down in the dumps right now about the
No, not at
prospect
all.
of Ukraine,
Not at all.
because this is an opportunity. This is an absolute opportunity. In my humble opinion, a Harris win would have meant a slow, strangulating death,
Yeah.
and it it would have been full of promises and full of nice words, but absolutely empty. I don't know that it's going to be the opposite of that with a Trump administration. I really don't know what the future holds, but I do know that there is opportunity to those who will be bold and to those who can articulate clearly the heart of the message which is at stake here in the Ukraine context. So we'll see what happens the next few months, and it's time to get to work.
Well, so well said, Honor. Thank you so very much. Well, thanks again for joining us on this edition of the Ukraine Story podcast. We exist here because of the support, prayers, practical support of our friends from around the world. We thank you so very much for that. We believe in freedom and we believe in fighting for freedom. And we believe that Ukraine is one of the defining issues for the future of the next generation's coming forward right now. And it's important for us to be with the people of Ukraine, the freedom fighters of Ukraine at this particular point in time. For Ukraine Story, this is DW saying we look forward to seeing you again in our next broadcast.